Well, welcome back to CEDA's Public Interest Technology Forum. If you weren't with us for the first session, let me introduce myself. I'm Melinda Salento, the Chief Executive of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. If you haven't logged on to our Pigeonhole app, please do so, ceda.pigeonhole.at, and the password is PIT2020. And of course, please get on social media and get some action going. Hashtag public interest tech and tag us at CEDA_news. Building confidence and trust that technology is being designed, developed and used for the benefit of people and that the risks are being considered and addressed seems crucial to creating an environment where the community embraces the opportunities presented by emerging technologies. Just how we can build confidence that human and public interest is at the centre of tech decision-making is the focus of this session. Joining us today to present their perspectives are Ed Santow, Human Rights Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and Dr. Matt Beard, who is a Fellow at the Ethics Centre. Both organisations have released papers related to this issue. The Human Rights Commission has released a discussion paper as part of a major project they have in train on the relationship between human rights and technology. If you haven't done so, go to their website, humanrights.gov.au, or a simple search of human rights and tech will get you there. Similarly, the Ethics Centre has released a paper titled Ethics by Design, and that's available at ethics.org.au. We'll start the session today with Ed speaking for about 10 minutes or so. Then we're going to get Matt to present his perspectives also for about 10 minutes. And then the three of us are going to have, I think, a fascinating Q&A conversation. So with that, Ed, welcome.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Melinda. My name is Ed Santow. I'm the Australian Human Rights Commissioner. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I pay tribute to the elders past, present and emerging of this land. Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast that some of you will be aware of called Revisionist History. In it, this famously contrarian thinker takes the listener back to the past to reinterpret something. It could be an event, it could be a person, it could be an idea. And the idea and the issue is that one of those things has been overlooked or misunderstood. It looks like he's having enormous fun. And while I wait for his company, Pushkin Industries, to invite me to submit my own piece of revisionism, I want to offer you the story of the Luddites. The term Luddite has become synonymous with people who are stuck in the past, people who cling to old ways of doing things long after it's become clear that science or technology has invented a new, better way of doing things. I'm sure we all know people like this. When I was a very junior lawyer, I remember a senior judge, who will remain unnamed for the purposes of this discussion, who was famously resistant to the internet. He was convinced that the internet was just a passing fad that should be politely ignored. If he ever gave a speech, he would insist that it not be uploaded to the court's website, lest he give unwarranted dignity to the entire futile project of cyberspace. Actually, there was one exception. On one occasion, he softened. He gave a speech that he was particularly proud of, and then he instructed his associate too, and I quote, "Fax this speech to the internet so others might read it." Anyway, you get the drift. Luddites are mulish people. They resist change, but without good reason. But what of the real Luddites? The Luddites arose during a period of huge upheaval in the textile industry. In the 19th century, new machines were being developed that enabled enormous change, or dare I say, disruption, to how clothes were made, speeding up the process and allowing enormous efficiencies to be made in how garments were manufactured in factories. The Luddites were textile workers whose livelihood was under threat. The name came about after a story, almost certainly apocryphal, of an apprentice named Ned Ludd, who was said to have smashed 2 or 3 of these new garment-making machines. Nowadays, we come to think of the Luddites as foolishly attached to the old ways, unable and perhaps unwilling to adapt with the times. But the reality was different. Luddites didn't oppose the new machines at all. What they opposed were the conditions of work in these new factories. called on to operate these new machines, the Luddites had no objection. What they simply wanted was two things: fair and safe working conditions and decent pay. From this revisionist perspective, the Luddites start to look much more sensible. And indeed, their plight should resonate with many people who are struggling to cope with the enormous upheaval caused by the current revolution that we're going through, the fourth industrial revolution. And that's the point at which I pick up the story that the Human Rights Commission has been contributing to in this, in this development in new technology. We see the opportunities presented by new technology. In fact, we are excited about the capacity of new technologies like artificial intelligence to help us develop our economy, but also to make our communities more inclusive, to improve a range of ways in which people experience human rights. Those positive things are real, and we're excited about them. But we also have to confront the reality, which is that for every one of those positive examples, there's also a dark side, an example of where new technology can actually cause real harm. And so what we are advocating is that we put humans at the centre of how we develop and use new technologies like AI. And then to make sure that when we come to regulating those uses of new technologies, that they're effective in protecting our basic rights. But I just quickly want to elaborate on a point that I just alluded to. I often feel like we're presented with a fever dream of visions. We have utopian visions of the world where AI is enabling huge strides. We've seen, for example, in areas like precision medicine, there is not just potential, but there's a reality of being able to use AI in ways that will actually improve our lives. We see, for example, in the way in which melanomas are now being diagnosed and gradings are being assessed, that AI is literally saving lives. But I describe it as a fever dream because that same technology, image recognition technology, is at the heart of something that is actually causing real harm as well. We've seen in countries like China how image recognition is used on faces, facial recognition, a particular type of facial recognition known as one-to-many facial recognition, can be used in social credit schemes in a number of Chinese cities. So, if you're doing something like crossing the road against a red light as a pedestrian, you can be automatically identified using facial recognition. You can lose social credit points. There's an increasingly authoritarian network of tech-enabled devices that can really cause enormous harm. And I describe it as a fever dream because we're constantly flitting between those utopian and dystopian visions. So what's the way forward? For us, it starts by rigorously applying existing laws that protect our basic human rights. And there are a lot of existing laws. We often are told that this field of new technology is ungoverned, perhaps even ungovernable space. It's just not true. We're not using AI to do things that we've never been able to do before. We're not using AI to teleport ourselves from one place to another. We're using AI to do things that we've always done, to make decisions, to enforce laws, all of those sorts of things that we've always done, but to do it in new ways. And so it's critically important that when we do just that, that we protect people's basic human rights in that process. And so applying those existing laws that have perhaps been inadequately enforced over the last few years is very important. To give a practical example, let's say you're applying for a bank loan. If you do so in a conventional way, a wholly conventional way, and you rock up to the bank manager looks you up and down and says, well, you know what? You're a woman, don't give bank loans to women. That's it. That's clearly unlawful discrimination. No one would have any doubt about that at all. But if it's an algorithm doing that, if an algorithm, in other words, a piece of AI trawls through a big data set and incorrectly identifies women as being less likely to pay back loans and therefore denies the loan on that basis, we sometimes question ourselves and think, well, is this still discrimination? The short answer is yes, it is. It is just as unlawful. And so we need to make sure that we're as effective at protecting people's basic rights and enforcing those consumer and human rights protections when it comes to AI as we are in the real world. And so the last thing that I'd come to is the role of ethics. And I'm really interested to hear someone as thoughtful as Matt talk about this. For us, there's a very important role for ethics to play in the overall regulatory regime. And that is to help fill the gaps where the law is silent and appropriately silent. There are some gaps in the law that need to be filled by new law. Perhaps less than we certainly thought of initially, but there are some important gaps that need to be filled. But we don't want to try and regulate innovation out of existence. We don't want to try and regulate every single conceivable situation. And so the proper role for us of ethics is to fill the interstices where people and companies and governments are able to make choices about how they design and use new technology. And what ethical frameworks can do is not be a substitute for good laws, but rather to help guide those choices, to help people make good choices that won't cause harm and that will contribute to a more inclusive community. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. That was really nice and concise. I've got some questions to come back to you on. No doubt we'll have an interesting conversation. But Matt, how about over to you? It was a nice baton hand from Ed in terms of the important role of ethics in filling the gaps. So interested to see how you see that and maybe give us a bit of a rundown on your guide as well. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. So I'm presenting from the land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. I just want to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging and the unceded sovereignty of their claim over this land. So just to follow on from what Ed has said, I think it's really useful to just do a little bit of work to articulate like the different things that can be meant when we talk about ethics in technology, because it means a lot of different things to different people, and the ways in which we frame that conversation can often really strongly influence the extent to which we think that ethics plays a role or doesn't play a role. And there's a lot of work in us all getting onto the same page here. So firstly, let's bust the biggest myth of all. Ethics is not a kind of alternative to law or an alternative to compliance. It's not the case that we can say, well, so long as everyone is very ethical, then we don't need to worry about all of these messy laws or kind of accountability regimes. Anyone who makes that claim seriously has a vested interest in the outcome. And we should be very, very wary when we're talking about public interest technology of someone who wants to go entirely down a route of ethics and self-regulation. Ethics is also plays an important role, as Ed said, in navigating some of the environments where we might want the law to stay silent. And I love that Ed's talking about it not as a rival to innovation, because that's often what we've said as well. We hear from a lot of organizations like, look, you know, all this ethics stuff is great, but it means we won't be able to do anything because there's so many processes and safeguards and methods in place. And my answer to them is always the same. If you don't have some of those processes, methods, and safeguards in place, you're not building good stuff. The role of innovation is to build good stuff that does the job that it's supposed to do. And we can't articulate in any sphere of life, including technology, we can't articulate the goal that something is meant to serve, the role that it's meant to play in our lives without including ethical considerations in that. You know, whatever appliance you have, if you have an appliance in your home that has this particular role, but it doesn't keep you safe because it's likely to explode, well, it doesn't matter how quickly it was produced or how fancy it is, it's not doing its job. Equally, if you're using technology, and technology, as Ed said, is helping us to do things that we've always done, to do them more efficiently, to do them more effectively, it's meant to amplify all of the different components of our life. And so if it's doing that by subverting our free choice our self-determination, if it's undermining issues of substantive justice. It's not the case that it's a great product, but it has these side effects. It's not a great product. So if you want to be building great stuff, you need to be incorporating these ethics into the process. It's not about rivaling innovation or curtailing innovation. It's about guiding innovation to make sure that it's actually fulfilling the promise that everyone who talks about innovation is trying to make, that this is going to make our lives better. But ethics says, well, if we're going to define better, we need to include a range of moral considerations within that space. So that, to me, is one of the functions of ethics, is to try to articulate in explicitly moral terms, in terms that encapsulate our values, what it is that we are trying to achieve when we go about innovation, when we are building new technologies, when we are disrupting an industry to try to improve things, that we try to make an explicitly morally driven and values driven case for why that trade-off is one that's worth making, especially if there are side effects, like Ed was mentioning, in the case of the Luddites and in the case of much more recent disruptions as well. So I think that's one of the functions of ethics. And I'm going to come at the end to what I think is, to me, the most important function of ethics. But first, I'll say a little bit about the work that we've done at the Ethics Centre as a way of kind of explaining this point. So a few years ago at the Ethics Centre, we started to get a range of different inquiries from all walks of life that all had to do with technology. Some of them had to do with existential risk. Some of them had to do with complex questions around AI and personhood and kind of really rich philosophical questions. But there were also some really practical questions. Organizations who suddenly realized that they were sitting on enormous amounts of customer data and they didn't know what to do with it, and they didn't know how to make sure that they were doing it well. Organizations who had some very public missteps and wanted to make sure that that wasn't going to happen in the past. And they were coming to us and saying, well, it's quite clear that we need some ethics, and then we would have a conversation. And we wanted to streamline some of that knowledge. And that's why we published Ethical by Design, Principles for Good Technology is the way that we described it. But we also tried to do it in a way that doesn't fall into one of the, I think one of the shortcomings of a lot of principles-based frameworks, which is just to articulate some very high-level ideas that no one would disagree with and then leave it there. So it's like, well, technology should do more good than harm. No one is going to argue with that claim. And someone who is building and designing or working in an organization, or someone who is deciding whether to purchase a particular piece of technology or not, they didn't need to be told that. They already knew that what they need to get needs to do more good than harm. So what we did was try to articulate that kind of higher level evaluative framework in the set of some kind of universal principles, but then to try to translate those down to the level of practice. So when someone is looking at a particular product, or they're trying to think about different data sets to pull in to make some machine learning training, to train a machine learning algorithm or something like that, how do they make those kinds of choices? And simply saying something like, you should respect the dignity of people, isn't necessarily going to get them there. And so we tried to translate those principles down through what we called kind of operational principles. You might call them maxims or rules of thumb, that help people to try to translate those kind of really high level concepts into something that is a little bit more grounded. And then to complement those, which are kind of prescriptive, we also added a series of open-ended questions, which when you're in the process of utilizing technology, developing technology, commissioning technology, some questions that you should be posing to yourself, to the person you're purchasing from, questions you should be posing to the various range of stakeholders or end users, in order to try to build a full picture of what is likely to happen and what the various considerations are when this technology comes into the world. One of the ethicists and philosophers who I'm a really big fan of is a woman named Carol Gilligan, and she talks about us as living on a trampoline. Every time we move, it kind of affects all of the people around us. And if we think about technology, especially the scale of some technologies, well, that's like throwing a bowling ball onto a trampoline. There's a chance that that is going to bounce all over the place and hurt a lot of different people. So we need to be really diligent in understanding who else is around and the various ways in which it's going to be affected. So that's why we built Ethical by Design. And just to highlight the principles that we articulated, and I'm not going to go into all the detail of the different rules of thumb, though I would encourage you to kind of check out the report. The ones we articulated was to start with a very basic principle, which is to think should before could. Technology is a world of opportunity, right? So there is a very natural instinct when you are good at building things to think about how far can I push this technology? What kinds of things could I do? And we've seen this happen in the academic space where people have wanted to see what they can teach a machine learning algorithm to do. Can we determine someone's sexual orientation on the basis of their face using facial recognition software? Which is just a question of curiosity. And we don't want to curtail curiosity too much, but we do want to make sure that it's not killing the cat. And in that case, if that was actually successful, there are places around the world where homosexuality is still illegal, where it might even carry the death penalty. And so to release that kind of technology or design that kind of technology and not be attendant to those risks is irresponsible. And so we need to be bearing those things in mind. We need to be thinking, well, should I do this? What are the values? What are the benefits that are going to be conferred by this right at the outset before we think whether it's actually possible to undertake that? Then at that level, so that's our starting point. That's just trying to get ethics to have a foot in the door in the conversation. Once it does, we think that we should be considering 7 things. Firstly, what we describe as non-instrumentalism, which is about recognizing that there are some things that have a particular kind of importance that we can't commodify, that we can't reduce simply to being a tool that sits within a broader technological system. So when you look at a large social platform, for example, those social platforms, ostensibly, you have a profile, you are a person on that platform. But in the way in which many of those platforms are designed, you're not a person at all with particular rights. You're not a person who has any intrinsic value. You are an instrument. You are a provider of data. And the system is not designed around you or to benefit you. You are designed to be part of the system. And when that happens, regardless of the outcomes, regardless of the effect, the fact that you have been turned into a mere cog in a wheel means that some moral harm has been done to you. We don't want to be doing that. And we've seen this given voice. The most notable case was in the German government's autonomous vehicles framework, where they said that we cannot think of individual passengers as being part of a system. We can't kind of reduce people to being aspects of the system. That's what we're trying to get at there. The second principle is self-determination. So as I said earlier, technology is a manifestation of human will. It's meant to let us do things that we wanted to do but couldn't, or let us free up our time so that we can do other things and not have to worry about the tedium. So it should be serving that goal of human freedom. It should be trying to liberate us. And again, we see lots of different technologies that utilize behavioral economics, that utilize dark patterns, that do any number of things that actually get in the way of our freedom rather than trying to augment it in different ways. The third principle is one of responsibility. So we think that it's really important that at the outset of producing technology, we're very clear about what we are responsible for, what we consider to be outside the realms of responsibility, and that we have really good and defensible reasons for articulating where we think the limits of our responsibility sit. I've already talked a little bit about the idea of net benefit, the idea that technology should do more good than harm, and also that we should be attendant to the negative side effects of the technology we produce. It's not enough to just go, well, on the balance sheet, it does more good than harm, and therefore our job's done. So much of the work needs to be done in attending to side effects, especially when, to bring up our next principle, those side effects tend to flow to already disadvantaged groups. And so our next principle is around fairness, or around kind of justice. We might say that we need to ensure that there are not some users who are disproportionately benefiting or disproportionately being harmed in the process of producing technologies. Related to this, we have principles around accessibility, so that we don't design with a particular user in mind. We ensure that we're accounting for all potential users and use cases. And finally, we have some conditions around purpose, that technology should do the job that it claims to do. It should be fit for the purpose that it aims to do, and it should be serving a purpose that we think is actually ethically defensible. So these are kind of the principles. And the problem that I have with a lot of principles-based frameworks is that they leave it there. And they say, righto, off you pop. We've articulated this now. We should never see bad technology made ever again. And of course, that's not the case. And one of the reasons that's not the case is to come back to where I began, because there is another role that ethics needs to play in this conversation. And it's one that I don't think we've taken seriously enough up to this point. And that's that ethics is not just a list of rules and a list of prescriptions of what we can and can't do. Ethics is the process of deliberating and thinking about how we live our lives in a way that is respondent to the various moral claims and commitments that we find in the world around us. It's a process of living what the Greek philosopher Socrates called an examined life, a life where we don't just take the things that are handed to us for granted, but we interrogate them and we explore them very deeply so that we're living a life that is our own. And that environment of reflective practice, that environment of deliberation, that idea that ethics is about a particular set of virtues, a particular set of character traits that define us as being excellent in our craft, I think that is the environment in which we need to be doing the most work, is in thinking about if we want technology that is going to serve and uphold human rights, if we want technology that is going to be responsive to some high-level ethical commitments, what kind of people do we need to be as the developers and designers of technology? What kinds of people do we need to be as the purchasers and commissioners of technology? And what kinds of people do we need to be as the users of technology in order to ensure that those kind of formalized commitments are ones that are actually translated into practice and internalized? Because we see in every organization that we walk into at the Ethics Centre, regardless of what line of work they're in, that the value statement that they have, the code of conduct that they have, is only as valuable as the extent to which it is translated into practice and embedded into people's behaviors. The mere existence of a document counts for nothing. It doesn't matter that we've written these principles down. What matters is that we actually give life to them. And I think that is the much harder task, but it's the much more important work of ethics to do that within a context of systems and guardrails and red lines and legal frameworks that we've established in collaboration with our colleagues working in legal and regulatory environments. And on that note, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. There was an awful lot in there, and you sort of encouraged the audience to go and have a look at the document. I would too, and similarly have a look at the Human Rights Commission discussion paper as well, because there is certainly a richness of content in both of those documents. Can I take you both back to I think an observation that sort of Ed wove into some of his comments, which is this sense that the things that you're both talking about are intended to sort of slow down or prevent the development and adoption of technologies, that they're not seen as being enabling. And just by way of background, obviously, you know, the driver for us in actually sort of having this conversation around public interest technology is a belief that building trust in how technology is developed and used, et cetera, is actually really critical to enabling a more supportive environment really for emerging tech, and a sustainable one. And so that's sort of the starting point for us. But I'm just interested in your perspectives on where we're at as a community and across different sectors in their attitudes to that. And maybe start with you, Ed.
Yeah, I really liked the way you framed that question, because when we've been thinking about that idea of slowing down as well, and we agree with it, but in a slightly convoluted way. We see it as slowing down in the same way that we took a lesson from the kind of old story of the tortoise and the hare. The problem with the kind of move fast, break things mantra that is so pervasive in new tech is that sometimes when you're moving fast and breaking things, you're breaking people. If you're innovating in a high stakes area and you put out a so-called minimum viable product that you know is not quite there yet, if it goes wrong, it can go wrong in ways that cause real harm. And to give a practical example, if you're developing a new, let's say a new gadget, and you know, we've seen lots of examples of this in the disability space. So if you're developing a new point of sale device, like a tap and go device. If it goes over a certain amount of money that you want to spend, you have to put your PIN on the screen. Some of those tap and go devices that are PIN on glass technology, they don't work if you're blind or have a vision impairment. They just don't work unless you design it really well, and you design it in a way that some of the leading smartphones have been designed to make it have a second way of using it for someone who is blind or has a vision impairment. So that problem, and I'm actually describing a real world problem that arose for one of the big banks. That problem is very difficult and very expensive to solve if you don't do it right at the start in the R&D process. But if you do take a mindful approach, we talk about human rights by design, and there are various other sort of similar approaches, design-led approaches, where you try and take a little bit more time to think through what are the likely problems, what are the likely breadths of consumers that will use your products and services, and you design accordingly. You're actually going to design better products. They'll be more accessible and much more likely to comply with people's human rights. And so, going back to the kind of tortoise and the hare, you're much more likely to be the tortoise that wins the race, or to kind of move off that analogy, you're much more likely to have a really successful, enduring product or service than someone who gets to market first, but then is kind of riddled with problems that they then have to try and reverse engineer solutions for.
Matt, what are your perspectives on that?
So I think I want to take a step back and just ask the question around whether trust is the right metric to be thinking about this through. Because if you talk to someone who works at a major technology company, they will point to their billions of users and say, look at all the people who trust us. Look at all the people who already hand us their data. We have their trust. And therefore, because we have their trust, because we've set trust up as the grand metric, therefore we have permission to do all of these things. And the problem is that when it comes to technology, we don't have a very good alignment between trust attitudes. So you ask people, they say, no, of course I don't trust, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Google, whatever it is. But they have an account and they're uploading photos of their kids, and they're doing all of these trust behaviors that cue a very different message. And so if we're going to use trust as a metric, the challenge is that we're not very clear in terms of our behaviors as users about how our trust affects our behavior, which is why we need to shift the conversation away from trust as an outcome and toward trustworthiness as a practice that we as the builders, that we feel confident that we are doing something that is trustworthy, independent of whether that yields trust as an outcome, that the process itself is inherent to that. And that, I think, allows us to slow down, because if we feel like we've already got trust, then it's like that speed bump of actually winning over people's trust or ensuring that we're trustworthy. That's taken care of. We don't need to worry about that, so we can move faster. But if we say that this is about being trustworthy, and part of trustworthiness is being diligent, and part of trustworthiness is actually accounting for all of the potential foreseeable side effects that we would miss if we move too quickly, then that creates an opportunity within organizations. I think one of the other reasons why we want people to slow down is because when we don't slow down, we tend to make choices that reflect our default settings. We make choices that reflect the status quo. We make choices that reflect default and usually unsurfaced value systems. And actually within technology companies, you get this vicious cycle because speed is one of the hidden things that they value. One of the things that they prioritize most is being able to move fast. And so unless we slow down enough to surface those and go, okay, why are we valuing the things that we do? What's motivating us in building this technology? What would be the situation for us if we didn't release this to market as quickly as we could? If we don't surface some of those unspoken assumptions around speed, then we don't know what else we're missing, and we don't know what things we could be prioritizing in place of speed. So I think it's not just about it being a slapdash thing that goes to market. It's also about saying, what are the default beliefs, be they beliefs that are inherent to capitalism, be they beliefs that are inherent to our team because we all went to the same university, or because we all come from the same kind of racial background, or we have the same kind of gender identity. That there are a range of beliefs that go unsurfaced in that process because we are so quick to go for the obvious things. What are the pain points we need to solve? What are the problems we need to issue? So slowing down is not about saying that we should move slower than is necessary. It's about saying you've probably been going too fast thus far, and we just want you to go at the appropriate speed. It's not slower. It's just the speed that you need to be traveling at.
The speed that you need to be traveling at to protect.
Yeah, to do all of the things that you need to do to protect all of the diverse range of stakeholders and user groups, to think about the broad and really complex system that you are always introducing technology into. We live in an incredibly complex environment. We need to be bearing in mind issues of sustainability, issues of substantive justice. We need to be bearing in mind a range of different effects that we are, when we introduce a new product into an ecosystem. That's not something that we can do well and do quickly. Anyone who has done any work around complex systems thinking will know just how hard it is to map the effects of some new actor when it's introduced into a complex system. And that's what we're doing when we build technology.
So let me ask you both where you think the sort of accountability for these frameworks and thinking sits. We've talked about the design and development phase, and Ed, you spoke to the idea that to be thinking about these issues up front and building them in at the design stage is optimal. I think there's a degree of kind of visibility that we might come back to, and then there's those who are sort of commissioning, applying, using within their business context, and then there's ultimately the end user, the consumer. And I guess I'm sort of thinking a bit too, Matt, about your point about trust, that people say they don't trust a whole bunch of social media platforms, yet surely there's an awareness now about what's going on with data that possibly didn't exist years gone by, but yet they continue to behave in a certain way. So at what point do we say, well, hang on, that responsibility lies with you? So maybe start with you, Ed, on your thoughts about how we think about that.
Yeah, well, starting with that question of trust, it's a really interesting one because we've done a really extensive community consultation over the last couple of years where we've tried to get to the bottom of what people are concerned about when it comes to the rise of new technology. Essentially, what they've been told to be concerned about up until recently were really narrow privacy concerns. So the typical situation, which I'm sure we've all experienced, is you're kind of searching for something online. In my case, it could be a new pram, to be very frank. And when that unhappy process of Googling is over, you then have prams marketed at you, for weeks for every website you go to, or so it feels. And when you ask people about that, they say, yeah, it's a privacy issue, it's unsettling. But it doesn't, as you say, Melinda, it doesn't actually change behaviour, which is really interesting. And in a way, that's probably pragmatic for a range of reasons. One is that it's probably not the biggest human rights violation going around. And secondly, it's hard to make choices where there are limited actors. So what we've been asking about is what are the other concerns that people have? And I think what's just starting to happen over the last couple of years in Australia is that people are clocking to the fact that that's actually not the thing that they should be worried about. It's not even in the top 10 of their worries. People have told us over and over again that they're worried that their personal information can be used against them. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is when it comes to the example that I gave before of applying for a bank loan, or it could be anything, but just to choose a random example. If you are essentially disadvantaged because of the way in which the algorithm trawls through big data and information about you as a woman or a person of colour or whatever it happens to be. And if you're unfairly disadvantaged because of that, that is something that people are very concerned about. And interestingly, that is something that will change behaviour. It's not something like the previous example that I gave about searching for prams online. And so when it comes to trustworthiness, it comes to people having a kind of a minimum level of trust in companies, they're increasingly looking at that sort of issue, whether they will be unfairly discriminated against, for example. And that I think is a good thing, in that I think we are shifting over to look at the sorts of things that we should be most concerned about. And then if I can just add one last point. So then what's the role then of law and ethics? Well, I think what we need to confront is a really difficult problem, which is that the early research about some of these ethics frameworks that have been put out there is that on paper they're very good, and Matt made this observation, I think. But in reality, the vast majority of them have had no discernible effect. And let me be really clear about that. Not just only a little bit of effect. I'm not saying not enough effect. I'm saying no effect at all. And so I think what that really goes to is the point that Matt made, I think, very eloquently before, which is that it's not enough just to come up with a good ethics framework. You actually have to apply it really rigorously in your business. And similarly, you have to make sure that the law that is there to protect you is effectively enforced.
Matt, I'm going to give you a chance too.
Yeah, I have a strange relationship that I'm still figuring out with accountability, for partly the reasons that Ed finished on there, which is that when we focus a lot of our attention on accountability, and I'm not going to take away from accountability the reasons I'll explore, but just for now, when we focus a lot on accountability, the response from those who might be held accountable is often to circle the wagons and to create for themselves really strong protections against being held accountable. And so long as they have protected against being held accountable, then they consider their work to be done. That's a problem for ethics for reasons that we've already talked about, which is that we need to do all of that embedding work because there are issues where regulatory regimes, accountability regimes, legal regimes will be silent, but where it's really important to do ethics work. And it also helps to explain, I think, a little bit of why we haven't seen the impact that we might have liked from ethics-based frameworks, because the belief is, well, for accountability purposes, so long as I have this framework and I can show it to, the VC, my venture capital, funders who require me to have an ethics framework, so long as I can give them that and tick that box, then my job is done. And so the risk with accountability is that if that's our only focus, then it stops from the issue that is at the core of it from becoming a real one that we are concerned with in a real sense, as opposed to just kind of, it's in our best interest to do as little as we can to kind of protect ourselves from this. And so we get this. On the flip side, it's really important if we're going to have justice that we have some kind of recourse. So there is a really important role for accountability within that context. So I think it's a very nuanced conversation about how we go about accountability in ways that make it genuinely motivating for the people who would be held accountable for them. As to who is held accountable, I think our default setting should be, well, if you build it, then you're accountable for the things that happen, particularly if they're things that had you gone slower, you would have been aware of. I am usually a little bit skeptical of claims that want to put a huge amount of responsibility on users. So Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, which is a company that actually does ethics quite well, is quite well known for saying, technology is a tool, whether we use it for good or evil is up to us. I think he's flatly wrong about that. Technology is not just a tool. Every time we build a product, we are building into it a series of values claims. We're building into it particular ideas about how it should or shouldn't be used, which is, a mode of thinking known as affordance theory. Basically, your technology issues a bunch of invitations to you. So if your privacy settings are really hard to find, then that's an affordance that affords, use the default privacy settings. If they're really easy to find and they're not too complicated, end user license agreements that you'd need 7 hours to read. That's a design choice. That's an affordance that says, don't read this, just click accept. And the accept is bigger and it's in green, and the, you know, do not accept is smaller, and that means you can't use the product. Like, there are a range of values that are hardwired and baked into these products. So the idea that it's like, well, it's just up to the user because you're free when you choose, is actually dishonest about what technology actually is and the way that it interacts with our choices. And for that reason, I'm usually reticent to hold users responsible. However, it is in a vacuum, on a balance sheet, we would want to hold users to some extent responsible for the choices they make. In order to get there, we need to have some of the accountability mechanisms in place, and we need to be able to see the builders of technology taking responsibility for their end of the bargain, so that we can start to level the power imbalance that's there between builders and users at the moment. Once we're there, I'm happy to have a conversation about user responsibility, but there's a lot of work to be done first.
Yeah, it's a fair comment. I think, Matt, you spoke about the distinction between trust and trustworthiness, and actually I think that's a point that our previous speaker, Hilary, who opened the forum, I think was sort of really making as well, in terms of start from a perspective of the things that cause people to distrust you and earn trust, which I think is about trustworthiness as well. But I think I'm interested in your perspectives on this, because I think in some ways you could avoid having a whole bunch of principles if you actually said to people, demonstrate your trustworthiness in a transparent way, and then others can kind of come and put the ruler over that and decide how well they're thinking you're doing. But that also requires a certain sort of capability. And so as a sort of final sort of question, I'm interested in the perspectives of both of you on where you think some of the critical players in our society are in terms of their capability to be actually unpacking these things in the way that you would expect them to, and that you believe the community would expect them to. And I mean government and also business. And I mean, this idea of should rather than could has come out, you know, through the Hayne Royal Commission, for instance. So it just seems to be that there's a bigger issue here around, or is there a bigger issue around capability, and what are your perspectives on that? Matt, I might start with you and then go to you, Ed, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, a really important one. And I think that we need to be honest and say that, you know, not just in technology, but as a society, our ability to reckon with systemic injustice, with systemic unfairness, has not been good. And that's going to be the same for technology as well. We have in a range of different institutions, in a range of different businesses, we have seen abuses of power. We have seen a failure to take the care and attitude that is necessary towards people who are vulnerable, and just about everyone's vulnerable in one way or another when you're dealing with organizations with this much power. So there is an enormous amount of work to be done in terms of building that capability. And it needs like I said, these are complex systems. And so it needs a system-wide rethink about how we undertake the kind of training that would be necessary. There's an academic at Melbourne University named Jared Field who wrote a wonderful piece for The Guardian after the destruction of the Yukon Gorge, saying that this is a real indictment on the way that we think about ethics within STEM, that the fact that a range of engineers didn't really strongly object to this, that they weren't able to attend to the sacredness of this land and what it actually meant to murder this land in the experience of the people it mattered to. And so we need to recalibrate, not just in terms of what the organizational metrics and motivations are, but our understanding of what it means to be someone who builds technology and the kinds of things that we're concerned with. We need to really go from the ground up here. And that means that we need to start with capabilities and with curriculum all the way through, so that it's not the case that ethics is one module that you do toward the end of your course, or it's a 1-week lecture that's bolted on to a 13-week discussion of machine learning and data analytics, that the entire conversation from the outset is embedded within a broader conversation around that there's a right and a wrong way to do this.
Yeah, thanks for that. Ed, final word from you?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Matt has just said. And I think he's presented quite a nuanced picture, which is very important because we need to understand that this is a multifaceted problem, and you have to approach a multifaceted problem not just from one facet. I'm going to be unnuanced because we've got a really fundamental problem that we perhaps don't confront enough, and that is that in this area of new tech, we keep on kind of trying to live in a deluded kind of world, which is that there's no rules that apply. And so while I agree with Matt that there are real limitations in accountability, we need at the very first to acknowledge that there are rules and that they should be applied. I mean, imagine if someone who was a kind of a white-collar criminal said, look, you know what, we should have a really kind of comprehensive debate before we talk too much about my conduct, about whether it's wrong to steal from shareholders and from customers. And let's make sure we talk about this for a good 10, 20 years before we kind of come down too hard on it. And of course, we wouldn't accept that. And it would be a delusion because there are already rules. It's true also in the tech area. And yet we're constantly told we need to have a big debate about whether technology and the use of technology should be regulated. It already is. And so I think that the first point that needs to be conveyed is that this isn't just an airy discussion about what you as a company would like to do, to in a sense, show what your kind of ethical perspective is on the world. There is a role for that, but the first step is just to comply with the existing law, and then we proceed from there.
Thanks so much, Ed. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. It's such a big topic, and I knew we would never be able to cover all of the nuance and ins and outs of it. But I just think it's important to get the different perspectives out there, and also put a bit of a plug in for some of the interesting pieces of work that you're doing, which I just think at the very least are just important for a conversation that I think is critically important in Australia at the moment. Just a quick update on the polls that we've been running through our Pigeonhole app. We asked viewers whether they thought human rights should underpin tech governance in Australia. 75% say yes, so 3/4 in the yes camp there. Ed's sigh of relief. And then we also asked, I think this maybe was something that I'm not sure which of the reports it was, but sort of put the proposition out there that Australia could and should become a world leader in ethical design, development, and use of technology. And glass half full there, guys. Just under 75% of the audience thinks that we can. And so there's more affirmation for the work that you're both doing. So many other issues that we could have touched on. Anticipatory regulation, which is actually trying to get ahead of some of this, is an area of particular interest to me. I've already said we're going to be having an interesting conversation about some aspects of that tomorrow, but maybe, Ed, something we can get you back on to talk about as well. Thank you both so much for your contribution today. Look forward to catching up again on this really important issue. For the audience, you've got 10 minutes again to stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee, cup of tea, and then come back for our next session, which actually is all about how we can empower consumers to use technology and data for their benefits more directly. So kind of putting them in charge of the tools a little bit more. Thanks so much, and I look forward to the next session. Thank you.